Hey y'all, welcome to another VFP convention. It's been an incredible journey so far. We're a little more than halfway through now, and man, we've had some really incredible workshops and trainings, um, just amazing panels, really powerful discussions, and an effective business meeting that seems to get less painful every single time, every single go around we do this thing. So it's typically when we meet in person, there's a large banquet. We're all settled in after eating some good food. I know we don't have the banquet this time, so I've asked Dave Logston to drive to everybody's home and deliver meals. So those should arrive any second now. I know it takes some time to drive from the East Coast to the West Coast. Be patient. You should get your 7-course meal from Dave any second now. So yeah, it's been a powerful convention. Adrian, what are your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. I'm blown away that it's already day 3. It's so much planning, so much preparation, so much awesome work from everybody, and it just goes by so fast. So I just really appreciate so many of the awesome panels. Again, I have to keep reminding people, if you didn't get a chance to see any of them, or all of them, I should say, they're available online. The allyship was fantastic. The intergenerational organizing, fantastic. I mean, everything has been great. And I really appreciate everybody's patience in the business meeting. I know that it's hard to completely duplicate what we do in person in an online setting, but we do try our best, and we will be continuing to make space for members to discuss our important subjects that we'll be voting on in October.
Great summary, and I agree. Those were some of my favorite points too in the convention, and we've still got a lot more to go. And even tonight, we have an amazing keynote speaker, but we're also packaging in all the traditional stuff we usually do during the banquet program. So we will have awards presentations and Presente later in the evening. But I don't want to leave our guest speaker backstage too long, because it's going to be a really amazing discussion. I think we're all going to learn a lot, and using fiction as a tool to help bring up these issues that we're working on, and a lot of people around the world are working on, how intersectional they are, and what we can do. It's really wild, and I think everybody's going to get a lot out of it. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Adrian introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Garrett. I have the extreme pleasure to be sharing the spotlight with Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is a university professor, Errol Arnold Chair of English, and Professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. An esteemed and acclaimed writer and author of books, fiction and nonfiction, that cover so many important stories and narratives and share with the world just an incredibly important perspective. In addition to your writing, which as I was doing my research before this meeting tonight, I see that you have recently put out a book with your son and a fellow illustrator and her son as well, and just talk about a really awesome kind of experience and ability to collaborate in the family. And that you're also involved in a lot of incredible works, to include the Diasporic, am I pronouncing that right? Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, and the Diacritics. And that you also are helping with the Center for Trans-Pacific Studies at the University of Southern California. So it's just amazing, the breadth of your experience. And I guess I wanted to first pass it on to you to kind of share those bits of your life that perhaps you'd like to share that aren't always covered in the introduction. So thank you
So
for joining us.
thanks so much for the introduction, Adrian. Such a pleasure and honor to be here at the Veterans for Peace Convention. You know, I was born in Vietnam in 1971 and fled with my family to the United States as refugees in 1975. And so, of course, I think that my life has been defined by war. It's been shaped irrevocably by war. I like to say that I'm a refugee, even though obviously by now I'm clearly a bourgeoisie, if you've taken this whole background here. But the experience of being a refugee has shaped my life. And one of the reasons why I call myself a refugee is because my memories start in a refugee camp at Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania. And let me just backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about my parents, because their refugee experiences and their war experiences are really crucial to who I am and why I'm here today. My parents were born in North Vietnam in the 1930s under French rule. My 88-year-old father, and I'm going to go see him tonight, still remembers the French songs that he sang in school. And so they grew up with war. Their entire lives were defined by war from the 1930s through the 1970s. And as Vietnamese Catholics, and when the country was divided in 1954, they were deeply afraid of communism and they fled south when the country was divided. So they were already refugees in 1954, and then they encountered 20 more years of conflict and war and were forced to become refugees again in 1975. And so I find myself to be comparatively lucky because despite having my life and the trajectory of my life being shaped by the war and by the refugee experience, I don't remember any of it because I was only 4 years old. My parents do. And everything that I've read about French colonization and the American war in Vietnam and everything else that happened in Cambodia and Laos and in the refugee experiences and in the aftermath is testimony to the devastation that was wreaked upon the people of Southeast Asia as well as American soldiers. And one of the things I really want to stress is that when I talk about refugee stories, what I'm also talking about are war stories. And I think we live in a society in the United States in which when people hear the word war, they tend to think about soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen and pilots and all that, guns, battles, tanks, generals, and all that. But in my experience, war equally affects civilians and arguably affects civilians more than soldiers. That might be controversial. We can talk about that. But civilians, you know, in the 20th century certainly bore a greater brunt of the damage of war than soldiers did. That was true in Vietnam as well. More civilians died than soldiers did. And the refugee experience is inevitable in war. It's an inevitable outcome of war. And for me, thinking about this has been really crucial to my development as a writer, my thinking about war and peace and the nature of these things and what kind of a role that a writer, a storyteller, and a novelist can play in this. But I think a lot about how my students, I teach a class on the Vietnam War as a general education course to students from all kinds of backgrounds, including a lot of veterans and ROTC cadets. And one of their tasks is to go out and interview survivors of the Vietnam War. That includes American soldiers and it includes Southeast Asian civilians and veterans. And one of the things that they find out, obviously, is that the war still has an impact 40, 50 years later or more. And that's one of the claims that I make in my work, that wars don't end simply because we declare them to be over. So the war in Vietnam was officially over in 1975, but the ramifications of it would continue for decades, certainly for the states and countries that were involved, but very definitely for the veterans and the civilians who were traumatized by this war. So what my students find out is that when they interview American soldiers and veterans, a lot of them went through terrible and traumatic things with what they did and witnessed and what happened to them. But a lot of American soldiers also sat on bases or did other things besides experiencing combat. But when they interview Southeast Asian survivors, whether they are veterans, whether they're civilians, every single one of those people has a traumatic story to tell, simply by dint of being a refugee who had to flee a country and come to the United States. And these kinds of stories of the civilians, the refugees, women, children, the ones who suffer from secondhand memories and secondhand traumas, these kinds of stories, I think, when it comes to war and peace, are pretty much invisible to so many Americans. And I don't think Americans are unique in this. I'm just talking about this because that's where we are today. So I think that the work of Veterans for Peace is so crucial because we still constantly need to hear from soldiers and service people who have been to war, what they have been through and what that is like. But we also need to hear from civilians as well. I'm convinced that if we're invested in peace, if we believe in the possibility of anti-war stories, that anti-war stories need to be told about civilians and refugees as well, because there is no glamour, there is no glory, there is no sanctification in terms of what war does to civilians. So if we were to really look at war's impact on civilians and the stories that they have to tell, I think we would find a greater trove of truly anti-war narratives and experiences than what comes out of soldier stories. We've seen over and over and over again, and I've read and I've watched so many war stories and war movies by Americans and by other nationalities where the anti-war message is strong, and yet constantly what we see is that war perpetuates itself, so that the spectacle and the glamour of war, even in anti-war stories by soldiers and veterans and about soldiers, still somehow never manages to get across the message in a way that can meaningfully change politics, that war is hell and we should stop fighting wars. I don't know if we hear from civilians and refugees whether we would be any more effective, but the nature of their stories is genuinely more anti-war, I believe, because there is nothing exciting or thrilling about losing your country, being forced to flee, dehumanized, rendered stateless, and being put into a refugee camp. So that forms the personal motivation for me, how I grew up here in the United States as a child, being Americanized, being exposed constantly to American war stories. I had a steady diet of Vietnam War movies in the 1980s. And as I say in my book, Nothing Ever Dies, all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. That was very true is very true still for the American experience of the war in Vietnam. I think it's true for the Civil War, that we're still fighting the American Civil War. It's undoubtedly going to be true for the wars that we are witnessing now and that we are finishing in one way or another. And so I grew up with that, but I also grew up surrounded by Vietnamese refugees. And so there was a very real disjunction for me between understanding that when Americans heard or said the word Vietnam, what they really meant was not the country, they meant the Vietnam War. And that this shorthand, this collapse between Vietnam, the country, and the Vietnam War was pervasive throughout American society. And because of America's power, because America is a global power, not just in terms of military might, but also in terms of its capacity to tell stories, the American perception of the war in Vietnam dominated the world. And so if Americans thought Vietnam meant the Vietnam War, so did much of the rest of the world as well. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese people and Laotians and Cambodians and Hmong who lived through that war and who suffered tremendous losses, somewhere around 3 million people for the Vietnamese, hundreds of thousands for Cambodians and Laotians. And if you count what happened in Cambodia during the genocide in the years after the war, an additional 1.7 million people, these are tremendous losses that most Americans don't know about and most of the rest of the world doesn't know about. But instead, what Americans and the rest of the world focus on when they hear Vietnam and therefore the Vietnam War is the American war experience. I grew up among Vietnamese refugees, intimately aware that the way they saw the war was very different from the way that Americans saw the war, and that many Vietnamese people, for them, the war had never ended, and the emotional toll of the war, the traumatic toll of the war, would continue. But whereas PTSD was a term invented specifically to describe the experience of American veterans of the Vietnam War, Vietnamese Americans, Vietnamese refugees did not use that language. They did not have that recourse to that language of trauma to describe what was happening to them. And so while American veterans could at least get some form of emotional and symbolic compensation because of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the eventual validation of the American veterans experience, for Vietnamese veterans of the war and for Vietnamese civilians, I think many of them felt that they were completely unheard and that their memories would be lost forever, even to their own children and grandchildren. So this contrast between the Vietnamese refugee world and between my experiences as an American being deeply exposed to American narratives generated for me a huge disjunction that helped to fuel my desire to eventually become a writer. And so a novel like The Sympathizer, which is about the war in Vietnam and about French colonization, is my attempt to tell a story that I felt hadn't been told. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it's just amazing that there are literally dozens, maybe hundreds of movies that Americans have made about this war, and literally thousands of books that Americans have produced about this war. And yet still, in all of that, I still felt that there was an original story to be told. And the reason why is because the originality of the sympathizer, whether you like it or not, is that it tries to tell this story from the many Vietnamese perspectives that were involved. And at least when we talk about things in English, that complexity of Vietnamese experiences is still very difficult to for many people to comprehend. And even in Vietnam, it's difficult. The Sympathizer, for example, has been published or translated in 27, 28, 29 countries and languages. It is not allowed to be translated and published in Vietnam because of what it has to say about Vietnamese communism in the aftermath of the war. So when I wrote The Sympathizer, my ambition was to try to offend everybody. And trust me, judging from my hate mail, I've succeeded. I get hate mail from American veterans of the war and Americans in general. I get hate mail from Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese refugees. And of course, the novel is not allowed to be translated into Vietnamese. So I'll end with that, just that it's a pleasure to be here to try to contribute in any way to this conversation and these concerns of Veterans for Peace.
Thank you. And, you know, as I was reflecting on what you were saying in terms of how we can raise voices and be a pro-peace force in the world, I think too about the pro-peace people who are standing up to oppose the war in Vietnam. And that actually in the 80s and 90s, although the United States government was involved in a lot of different nefarious dealings, that the public ultimately was more in for peace than of going to war. And I remember that in the run up to the first Iraq war, in which the United States invaded in 90, that they were trying to figure out how to, you know, get Americans behind the war, and coming up with the line, support the troops. You got to support the troops. You're not allowed to think about what they're doing. You just have to support them regardless of what they're doing. And that's something we certainly think about when we're trying to figure out how do we like counter that narrative and make sure people know that supporting endless war does not support the troops. It doesn't support anybody except for people who are profiting off of war and whatever other things they might be gaining from it.
In my book, Nothing Ever Dies, I think I touch upon some of these issues because that book is about war and memory, about how the war in Vietnam has been remembered by many different sides, the United States, the Vietnamese of all sides, Laotians, Cambodians, the South Koreans who went and fought there, 300,000 South Koreans, 5,000 South Koreans died there fighting with Americans, and their efforts have been poorly remembered here, and they have their own problems in memory in South Korea. But in that book, I mean, part of what the argument of that book says is that every side in a conflict will validate its own experiences. In other words, when we talk about the processes of memory and forgetting, whether it's our own individual processes or the collective processes of a culture, a community, or a nation, there's a vested interest, obviously, in remembering our own humanity and foregrounding the inhumanity of others. It's one of the most basic mechanisms, obviously, for mobilizing people to go to war and to support soldiers. And regardless of the fact that we've seen it over and over and over again in the past, we have seen it now, and we will see it again whenever there's a new war to be fought. And it's very, very hard to overcome this kind of binaristic relationship of memory and forgetting, especially as applied to us versus them. And I think that you know, when it comes to this question of peace and how might we get there, especially around the question of narrative, because that's what I'm involved with as a storyteller, what I argue in that book is that it's not enough for those of us who are invested in peace to acknowledge our own inhumanity, as difficult as that might be. For example, pointing to the atrocities that our own side commits, which inevitably happens. And it's not enough to idealize our victims, because we do that too. You know, if you look, for example, at the Vietnam War, talk specifically about this as an example, the anti-war movement, the American anti-war movement, has foregrounded the atrocities that American soldiers have done. That's why, for example, we know about the My Lai massacre, and we can talk about the My Lai massacre. There's a capacity to acknowledge American capacity to commit atrocities. And the flip side of that is the anti-war movement has often idealized the other side as victims and as heroes. And that has happened again in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan as well. But from the perspective of narrative, of storytelling as a way of accessing truth, and I hope, I try to do that. And I think most of us who are writers try to do that. Whether we succeed or not is a different issue, but we try. In order to access the truth, what we have to acknowledge is that we are both human and inhuman, and they are human and inhuman too. It doesn't do us any good to idealize our victims and our enemies purely as being heroic or as being angelic. It's simply not the case. And so when we actually acknowledge the complexity of the other, whether they are our allies or our enemies, we acknowledge them in their full complexity as human beings, as we acknowledge ourselves. And the reason why I think this is crucial, and the reason why I think it's difficult for a lot of Americans to understand this, is because it's easier to idealize or demonize others versus think about them as fully complex human beings. Because if we thought about them as fully complex human beings, we would have to give them time to speak and acknowledge their stories. And we, like pretty much every other country in the world, would rather focus on our own stories. And so a novel, again, like The Sympathizer, is designed to force people to confront this full complexity. And it's not a surprise that a lot of people would rather not do that. That's why I get hate mail from Americans, because like, whoa, they read the opening of the novel and they're like, you are so anti-American when they read the first 3 or 4 chapters. And they sort of missed a point that I make in the novel, which is, I love America too. Hey, I love hamburgers too. But I also think we have a military industrial complex that kills millions of people. And can we reconcile those two things? And then I get Vietnamese readers don't like it sometimes, because the South Vietnamese American readers who idealize South Vietnamese veterans and demonize their communist enemies do not want to hear the possibility that South Vietnamese soldiers could be heroic and could also be corrupt or cowardly or villainous or commit atrocities or whatever. And likewise, if you go to Vietnam, you go to the Vietnamese historical museums, what you'll find is the same narrative over and over and over again. The Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese Communist Party are heroes. The outsiders, the French, the Japanese, the Americans, the Chinese are villains, and the South Vietnamese are traitors. They also don't want to hear any contradiction to this narrative as well. So if we have the courage to say this, that we should not be idealizing or demonizing ourselves or others, but to think about us in our full complexity, we are actually venturing into really complicated moral, emotional, and narrative territory. And it is quite challenging to tell things in their full complexity.
I couldn't agree more in terms of, and it's something that I have struggled with myself as well. I was an Arabic linguist in the military. My instructors, I learned Arabic in the military. My instructors were all from all over the all over the Middle East. And I learned so much of the history and Aryan culture. And it can be fall into this pitfall of the dichotomous thinking that we're wrong, they're right, regardless and wherever. And I think it's caused some problems even within our own organization of people who are legitimately saying the United States needs to stop intervening in the internal affairs of other countries, and leave them alone and let them have the right to their own self-determination, but at the same time idealize them as being perfect. And that doesn't get us anywhere. It makes for a very short synopsis, but not a very accurate one. And I have a question, Ken, that's kind of goes along this line. We were talking a bit before in the background about Americans pulling out of Afghanistan. And as this is coming to a close, if you had some thoughts or perspectives you'd like to share with us about not only the withdrawal, but also how can we, like insights into how we can help raise the voices of Afghan people, which is something we've been trying to do and bit successful, but certainly not speak for them, but find a way to amplify their voices.
Yeah. I obviously now you're starting to see all these comparisons to the Fall of Saigon in people's punditry and essays and tweets and all of that. And of course, I think there is a pretty good comparison to be had there. But we should also look at some of the limitations of that kind of analogy. The first one is that as chaotic as the Fall of Saigon was, as ill-prepared as Americans were, and as much as Americans tried to deny that it was happening, there was still kind of a plan that the United States had to evacuate people. And the United States, in the chaos of the last 2 months of March and April, did manage to evacuate 130,000 South Vietnamese people from Saigon and from other places. And my family was among those 130,000 people. Now, there were also at least 1 million other South Vietnamese people who were affiliated in one way or another with the American war effort, who also needed to be evacuated as well. But nevertheless, 130,000 people, as inadequate as that was, is still a huge amount more than what the Biden administration is talking about. They were talking about numbers in the low thousands, which blows my mind that that's the figure that they're discussing. And of course, they're also talking about trying to send as many people as possible to other countries besides the United States. So, we need to give, the Americans of that time in 1975 credit for taking 130,000 people, getting them to the United States with relatively few questions asked. What's also important to point out is that South Vietnamese were comparatively lucky, that very few Cambodian, Laotian, and Hmong allies were evacuated in March and April of 1975. And they paid a huge price for what took place. Nevertheless, the United States did try to make up for its failures in this regard, and did take in literally hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian refugees in the 70s and 80s and 90s through various kinds of programs. So that's the other point where the analogy to the Fall of Saigon, I fear, is going to be limiting, because again, we're getting back to this idea that the war in Vietnam existed for Americans as their own debacle and their own spectacle. That is, that war had meaning only in terms of what it meant for Americans. For so many Americans, when they say or hear the Fall of Saigon, what is in their minds is that stupid image of the helicopter on top of a roof, which people keep saying was the roof of the embassy, and it was not. But nevertheless, that's their image. And I fear that when people bring that up, what they do is that they think that the war ended, or the experience of the South Vietnamese and the refugees ended at that moment with that evacuation, when in fact, like I said, it would continue for decades and decades in terms of what people were trying to do to leave Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And so, as terrible as this moment, I assume, will be, like I'm assuming that what we're going to see is the fall of Kabul. As terrible as that is, it's not actually the end of the experience. And I'm afraid that Americans will simply turn away the moment that the Taliban, if they do, captures Kabul, when in fact the experiences of Afghan people under the Taliban regime will continue for quite a long time, and our obligation to them, and I believe we do have a moral and political obligation to them, will continue. So what do we do? So I put most of this into an essay that I've submitted to the New York Times. We'll see if they publish it, but I think it is beholden on all of us to do, with our limited capacities, to organize, to mobilize, to speak out, to do whatever we can within our power, and to get others to speak up as well. All of you know other veterans, other organizations. It's time to be as vocal as possible in as many places as possible to try to guilt and shame the Biden administration to do a lot more, a lot faster for many, many, many more people than is currently being planned. Because there's just, as I read the Joe Biden statement today that he just put out about what the United States is doing in Afghanistan, it just strikes me as boilerplate, trying to pretend that everything will be okay, that the United States is doing its job, and it's again, the administration trying to put the best face on things when to almost everyone else it seems like the disaster is about to happen, and not preparing for that disaster has already, in my mind, been criminal enough. We should have been evacuating Afghans well before this. And now with time rapidly running out, we need to be doing everything we can to evacuate many more.
It's an incredibly true and point to make, and it's also true. I mean, the difficulty people have coming into the United States now under really hard circumstances the bureaucracy involved is so many times amplified what people, the horrible bureaucracy that existed in the past. In your travels, I think we also had the opportunity to talk a bit about your experience traveling back to Vietnam. And I wondered if you would like to share with us a bit about your experiences and reflections.
Sure. I did obviously want to return to Vietnam since I was born there. I've been there several times as a student, as a scholar, as a tourist. I was like, hey, it's fun. It's affordable. It's fun. It's getting more expensive every day. So you should, as soon as COVID is lifted, you should try to go. And I've encountered many American veterans who have been back to of that era, who've been back, and I think uniformly they talk about how important that experience is for them. And also it's important for Vietnamese Americans and other Vietnamese people of the diaspora to return back and to see how the country has changed and to meet family members and to go through all of these very difficult emotional experiences. And then I also went back because, I was doing research for this book that became Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War. It took me about well over a decade to research and to write that book. And part of what that involved was physically traveling throughout the country to see the long-term effects of the war and how the country had rebuilt and how the country had sought to remember the war in different ways. And not only Vietnam, but also I traveled to Laos, to Cambodia, to South Korea to see how these processes of commemoration had taken place, because what I really wanted to understand was, again, these processes of memory and forgetting. And I'll tell you, when I started writing that book, it was a very self-interested book. What I wanted to do was to think about how Vietnamese Americans had remembered the war, because as I said, it felt to me that we had been completely forgotten in the ways that this war had been remembered both in the United States and in Vietnam. We, the losers, were completely effaced. And so I wanted to write a book to repair that memory, to fill in that memory. And what I discovered is that impulse to fill in a gap, as laudable as it might be, is also a deeply limited impulse, because every effort to fill in a gap of narrative, if that's the logic that we're using, is very probably going to repeat the logic of exclusion that led to that gap in the first place. Now, this is why we see that people who have been victimized for whatever reason, let's say victimized through war, will turn around and victimize others in exactly the same process. Because what they do is they say, well, we've been victimized and now we're going to compensate for that. I think that's exactly what happened after 9/11. The Americans felt victimized by what happened, justifiably. But then instead of learning from that experience, simply repeated the process of victimization. Now we find ourselves in the situation that we are in today. So we have to be able to think outside of that logic of victimization, filling in the gap, reversing the terms, and all of that. And so that's why it was necessary for me not just to visit Vietnam, but to step outside of Vietnam and go into Laos and Cambodia and South Korea, where I was an outsider, and to see how the war was being remembered elsewhere. For example, in Cambodia, the Cambodians do not like Vietnamese people because they feel, rightfully so, that the Vietnamese invaded and colonized Cambodia. You have to remember, much of what is South Vietnam was formerly Cambodia that the Vietnamese conquered. The Vietnamese people do not remember this. And so it's one of the ironies that many Vietnamese people will immediately say, we were colonized by the Chinese for 1,000 years, and we were invaded by the French and occupied for more than 100 years, and the Americans were here for 20 years, and so on and so forth. And they will not bring up the fact that modern Vietnam was built on the conquest of the Cham and the Cambodian peoples. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. If we cannot step out of the logic of filling in the gap, of validating our own experience, of saying, well, we've been forgotten, now let's remember ourselves, we're going to repeat the same processes of violence, conquest, and imperialism that have defined the histories of so many countries. Even countries that have been colonized and victimized by other countries have probably colonized and victimized others, but they will completely erase that because they participate in the same logic of remembering and forgetting. So it's so crucial, I think, for us to expose ourselves to the narratives of other people who do not see history and experience in the same ways that we do. I think this is why a lot of Americans who go to Vietnam are deeply shocked when they go. They step into, for example, the War Remnants Museum in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and the first thing they're greeted with, I believe, as you enter the museum on the first floor, is a sign that says something like war crimes, atrocities. And what they're talking about are American atrocities committed in Vietnam. There's a whole wing devoted to Agent Orange. There's a whole wing devoted to the My Lai massacre, and on and on and on. And for a lot of Americans, this is their first exposure to being seen as the enemy. They've grown up thinking about themselves as the heroes or even as the anti-heroes, but nevertheless, they're at the center of the story. They step foot into a Vietnamese historical museum and they are at the margins being categorized as the villains. It's deeply upsetting for a lot of Americans to encounter this perspective, and the reaction from a lot of them, because I've read the log books, there are these guest books that you can sign as a visitor. About half of Americans will say this is total propaganda, and the other half of Americans will say we're really guilty. We feel terrible that we did this. But the challenge is, again, for the guilty Americans to look up beyond their guilt, not to idealize the Vietnamese. And the challenge for the defensive Americans is not to be defensive. It's these are really hard challenges to overcome. But unless we expose ourselves to perspectives that contradict not only what we think we believe, but what we emotionally believe, which lies under the surface, we're never going to be capable of transforming ourselves. I'll just give you one final example of what I mean by that. I think a lot of Americans, for example, the liberal Americans will say, hey, we're against war. We're all for people of color. We're all for these people in other countries we fought wars in, and so on and so forth. But beneath that, a lot of these same Americans, the liberal ones, are deeply invested in American exceptionalism. And if you contradict that, they will not respond well. And this is why I think the Sympathizer did find some challenges. It was rejected by 13 out of 14 publishers when we sent it out, because I think it didn't simply try to idealize Vietnamese people, which I think liberal Americans are capable of dealing with, but it castigated American exceptionalism. And that is unsettling, again, for so many Americans who take it for granted that they are at the center of the world. And if you try to dislodge that perspective, that deeply emotional investment, Americans have a hard time hearing and listening to these other perspectives.
Incredibly, incredibly true. I mean, and that's what many of us have experienced, even doing peace work as Americans, and trying to even talk with our family about our experiences in the military, and how many of us have had such strains put on family relationships because even when we try to share our own experiences, it conflicts with their idea of what America is, and they just can't handle it. And it just, it's such a valid point. And it reminds me too, a lot of what you've been sharing, the idea that there is no real big T truth in the world. There's a lot of little t truths based on all of our experiences. And that just like, I remember I absolutely loved history. I loved learning about history. I ended up getting a double major in history just because I absolutely love exploring that topic. And yet going into it, I had this idea that history could be unbiased. And I remember in one of my classes where they're talking about labor workers and unions and organizing, how many of my classmates were just floored. They're like, this is so biased. It's just from one person's perspective. Where's the rest of the narrative? And if they were really concerned in sharing the entire narrative of the United States in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you probably couldn't even do that in a year or two, just focus on that period. But I guess that's part of it too, is that there just isn't a simple answer to our experiences as people on this planet. And it gets so complex, and people being open to that complexity it's hard.
And I want to say it's a learning experience. I think it's clearly you're talking about a trajectory of your own experience and revelation and all of that, and then trying to get other people to recognize and understand what you've been through and the stories that you have to tell. But it's true for everybody. It's true for me too. Recently I've thought about this experience that I mentioned at the very beginning, and as someone mentioned in the chat. about Fort Indian Town Gap, Pennsylvania, where I was, where we were resettled. And you know, for my entire life, most of my life, I never thought twice about that military camp, Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania. But I'm writing a nonfiction book now that's partly memoiristic, where I think about what that experience was like in 1975. And then I thought, well, why is it called Fort Indian Town Gap? Never actually thought about it or never investigated it. So I did investigate it a little bit. And of course, the reason why it's called Fort Indian Town Gap, and there's still a military base with that name, is because it was a fort built to defend white settlers against indigenous populations in the wars of the 18th century. And so here we are as Vietnamese refugees being rescued, brought to the United States, expected to be grateful for our rescue, and being put into a military camp that is named after anti-Indian campaigns. So what does that mean? For me, I think what it means is that for so many of us who came as refugees, also as immigrants to the United States, we are evidence of the American dream, of American exceptionalism. That of course people want to come here to the United States, we're the greatest country on earth. And that is an ideology that a lot of refugees and immigrants totally absorb as well. And part of that absorption means being blind to fundamental parts of American history, such as the genocidal foundations of American society, American country, in terms of the wars against Indians and the appropriation of lands. So what I'm saying here is that even for myself, it's taken a lifetime to recognize these contradictions, that on the one hand, I'm a refugee from a war that the United States had some role in, and yet I came here to the United States and found opportunities and privileges that are not simply a part of the American dream, but are also a consequence of this legacy of colonization, or this ongoing history of colonization, as Native peoples would say. They would say that, I mean, a lot of Native people would say colonization never ended, it's still ongoing as a process for indigenous peoples in this country. So I think that once we begin a journey of revelation, where we start to think about history and power and who we are as individuals and as a people, and we continue to make these connections, and again, look beyond our own experience and our own trauma, our own victimization, whatever that might be, and we start to make connections, we start to see this very complex web that we're all enmeshed in. Because in fact, I think everything that we're talking about is a part of a larger complex of historical events that are all connected to each other throughout American history. So it's not a surprise that a Vietnamese refugee would find himself in a base named after an Indian campaign.
Listening to you sharing that, I just, as my husband's like to say, I goosebumps, just in terms of the connections and complexities. And I don't know, I kind of have to take a deep breath, and perhaps go to a question. We have a few minutes to wrap up, and I know people wanted to hear more about your connecting with Vietnamese writers and authors and artists, and finding different ways to and space to amplify their voices.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned in your introduction that I'm a part of a group called the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, and again, out of the same impulse that Veterans for Peace was formed. When you see an absence, you have to fill it. You have to fill it. If there's no organization doing what you want to do, if there's no one telling the story you want to tell, you got to do it yourself. So we as Vietnamese American artists and writers felt that we needed to amplify Vietnamese American artists and writers and their voices, but beyond that, also to form this global community, because one of the consequences of the war in Vietnam was the creation of a global Vietnamese diaspora. There's 90 million people in Vietnam, which is incredible to imagine. Vietnamese people are really reproductive, apparently, because there's only about like 30 million, I think, in 1975. 90 million people in Vietnam, but about, I think, at least 4 million Vietnamese people in the diaspora as a consequence of the war and everything that happened afterwards. And so they have all these kinds of stories and voices to tell. And again, what happened to that? Oh, too, is that of course we want to make connections with artists in Vietnam and writers in Vietnam, and to amplify their voices, because certainly one of the ironies of the American war in Vietnam is that even though Americans lost that war, in fact, they have won that war in memory. So again, this idea that the American power to dominate the world is not just military and political and economic, but also cultural. I'll give you an example of that. I went to Italy to promote the Sympathizer. I was interviewed by a radio host who was a communist, very popular radio host, and very much against the American war in Vietnam, very pro, Vietnamese people, but she loved Apocalypse Now. And she did not see the contradiction between her politics and the fact that a movie like Apocalypse Now completely centers the American experience and silences Vietnamese people. So for most people, they can just turn on their television or internet or whatever, and they'll get an American story, no matter where they are in the world. But to get a Vietnamese story, most people have to travel to Vietnam to do that. And so it was really crucial to do things like build these networks, translate and publish Vietnamese voices in English from Vietnam, which is what we're trying to do now. And so, there is obviously a vibrant scene in Vietnam culturally in terms of film and literature, despite modes of censorship and government control. And it's important to sort of listen to the concerns that are the kinds of stories that are being told there, because again, for most Americans, when they hear Vietnam, they think Vietnam War. So for them, Vietnam is continually trapped in the past around an experience that is important to Americans. But if you go to Vietnam and if you watch contemporary Vietnamese movies and read contemporary Vietnamese literature, a lot of it is not about the war. Because those 90 million Vietnamese people, most of them were born after the war. Most of them want to do what everybody else wants to do, which is make a living and make money and all that kind of thing. They're basically, most Vietnamese people are basically capitalists. They're not thinking about the war, especially because in Vietnam, the war's memory is dominated by the Vietnamese Communist Party, and their cultural productions are not exactly the most exciting things around. So I think recognizing Vietnamese humanity and complexity for Americans means recognizing that it's not only about the war. And that's really hard for a lot of Americans to comprehend. Now, that being said, a book that I really recommend by a contemporary Vietnamese writer, and I'll have to type it in here because you might have a hard time transcribing her name, Viet Thanh Nguyen, wrote a novel called The Mountains Sing. And that's a really brilliant novel. I blurbed it as being the Vietnamese version of the Grapes of Wrath, and it really is. I mean, it's a novel that looks at Vietnamese history from the famine of the 1940s, which my parents survived. It killed 1 million Vietnamese people in the North at a time when there was probably like 15 million Vietnamese people in the North. So a huge, terrible devastation caused by the Japanese and the French. Goes from that period of the famine through the land reform of the 1950s, which is when the Vietnamese Communist Party of North Vietnam decided to, try to liberate the peasantry. And part of the way they did that was by killing a lot of landlords, including a lot of people who were not actually landlords. And then ending in the period of the American War, and then afterwards, the immediate aftermath in Vietnam. So it's really amazing because Viet Thanh Nguyen is completely bilingual, bicultural, born in Vietnam, grew up in Vietnam, married to a foreign diplomat, writes in both Vietnamese and English, is an incredible translator and ambassador. And the novel is really incredible. So if you had to read one novel that I think is about the contemporary perspective on things, I would read that. I'm sure most of your audience has already read Bao Ninh's The Sorrow of War. It's I think one of the great war novels of all time, not just a great novel about the North Vietnamese perspective on the war. So I mean, hopefully that helped to answer the question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate your comment. One of the things that's been running in the back of my mind is, I think it was 2014, I attended an international social work class that was held in Finland with social workers from all over the world, including a woman from Vietnam. And she was a bit younger than me. But I was talking with her quite a bit throughout the 3 weeks we're in Finland. And at the beginning, I totally went to, what were her thoughts about the Vietnam War, the war in Vietnam, as I'm American war in Vietnam, as I'm trying to remind myself to rephrase how I say that, and the lasting legacy of Agent Orange. And, she let me know very quickly that Vietnam is a very young country, and that so many people, uh, the war was not an occurrence in their lifetime, and that, as you were kind of sharing, that people obviously have a much deeper and richer experience in their country. And it was interesting because travel, it's so important in terms of learning and connecting with people. And it took me going to Finland and meeting with a woman who happened to be in the same classroom in Vietnam to get that different perspective. We can't always be traveling, but with the us embracing Zoom and Zoom meetings and online technology, one of the things that out of everything bad happening with COVID is something I think we're all learning how to do maybe a bit better. It's certainly possible to share ideas and stories and our experiences as people a bit easier than perhaps it was a couple of years ago. And so I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you sharing with us. And I would also like to say, if you have any last thoughts you would like to share in these final few minutes, please do so.
I'm just grateful for the opportunity to speak to Veterans for Peace. I think it's incredibly important work that you're doing. I think it's always important to hear from people who have been to war or in the military, what their experiences were like, especially as we obviously live in a society now with so few people serve. I had the opportunity to go give a speech at West Point. I was invited to talk to all of the plebes, about 1,000 of them there. I was terrified. I was like, oh my God. I'm sort of the antithesis of the kind of person who would go to West Point. And I felt I had to do that because it is beholden on all of us to participate in our society, whether it's by joining the military or becoming a teacher or by engaging in dialogues and conversations with people who are not like us. I'm not like a lot of the people in this Zoom conference because I never served in the military. I'm not white, like I think a lot of people probably are, from what I can tell. But it's so crucial to engage in these conversations and dialogues, even if they terrify us. You talked about, for example, even just talking to your family and how difficult that might be. It certainly is difficult for a lot of us who are Vietnamese Americans of my generation to talk to an older generation that is deeply anti-communist, and yet we have to do it. We have to do it. And I went to that auditorium. I spoke to those 1,000 plebes. I confessed that I was probably the weakest person in the room and relative to them. And I said a lot of things I said today. I said, that we have to recognize our nation, our country in its full complexity, both the beauty of it and the brutality of it as well. It's a complicated truth. And I think that's what you have to offer. You have the legitimacy of your experience and your service, of your commitments. And I hope a lot of people will listen to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, I see that so many people are saying how much they appreciate you coming and joining us. And perhaps we can figure out some ways to continue our conversations in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adrienne.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Awesome. Wow. There's a lot to reflect on there. Just talking about these complexities, seem to strike me with individuals, looking at them as complex beings, making it impossible to other them, how we get manipulated into war and conflicts by othering people, by degrading their humanity, and also the complexity of nations and people. We get stuck all the time in this binary thought of, one side or another. When we have the capacity to look at ourselves in complex ways, why can't we just make those assumptions about other people? It's amazing, and it's a it's really great that we got the opportunity to hear all that. Adrian, do you have any last words, and then we'll move on to some awards?
Phew. I don't know why I was so incredibly over the top nervous. This was the part that I was the most nervous about, which many of you might find hard to believe, considering that I had our some of our members to contend with, and just trying to figure out how to do the business meeting the right way and have this space. So I'm really happy, and I really appreciate people who shared questions in the Q&A, and yeah.
Well, feel free to relax. Maybe we'll bring you back in towards the end, and you can say goodnight to folks. Next up is our awards ceremony. Just like last year, instead of kind of awkwardly handing an award to somebody expecting some spontaneous speech, our awards committee reached out to individuals who were close to or nominated the winners and asked them to say a few things. And we got those recorded in an incredible video, and we're going to run that for you right now for the awards ceremony.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Kinney. I'm currently serving as the president of the board of directors, and this year I had the privilege of sitting on our awards committee. And before I get to the award I will be presenting, I just want to say how much I appreciate everything that our members and chapters have done over the past year. It has been incredibly difficult times to organize in, and people have just risen to the challenge. It's interesting because, just a couple of years ago, people weren't too keen on using online media platforms and other ways of communicating. And yet when we had to, we learned how to, and we overcame, and people are doing some great work. So without further ado, I am very happy to say that this year's chapter of the year goes to Rochester. And I'm kind of happy about that as a fellow Central New York member who just recently moved back to my hometown. But Rochester has just been doing some amazing work through a lot of challenges. So they have been able to maintain meetings. They have organized online meeting spaces. They have given our national projects and other working groups a platform to share their work. And they also create a really wonderful space for new members to get involved and get engaged in a supportive way. So I'm really happy with everything Rochester has been able to do this year. I'm happy with so many of our chapters, so many of our members, so many of everything that Veterans for Peace is doing. And thank you. And congratulations, Rochester.
Hi, my name is Joey King, and I'm the past president of the Veterans for Peace chapter here in Nashville, Tennessee. I was also a member of the Veterans for Peace board for many years, and very, very pleased to be announcing the Gandhi Nonviolence Award for 2021 is going to Mr. Hector Black. Hector was a member of our chapter for many years, worked in counter recruiting, did many events with him. And he is the most Christ-like person I've ever met in my entire life. Those of you who didn't get a chance to know Hector when he was still with us, you really missed something. He passed away just after last year's convention. And the way this award is written, it can be awarded posthumously to people who passed away since the last convention. Hector was a World War II veteran, and he started a life of peace that began somewhere around 1946 when he went around France to see some of the people that he would have been killing in 1946, and decided that he was on the wrong path and turned to Quaker meeting, and if you really want to do some research and you've got about a day's worth of reading to do, look up Hector Black and Quaker, and you'll find so much stuff that you can't read it possibly in a day. One thing he's very well noted for is his daughter was killed by a man, and he got before the jury and told the jury that he hated what the man did, but he didn't hate the man, and talked them out of giving him the death sentence. And for many years, continued to write and send Christmas presents to the man who had killed his own daughter. So cannot thank the committee enough for making this award to Hector. I think it's the first time we've ever awarded something like this posthumously to a former member, and we cannot be more thrilled here in Tennessee to be giving this award to his 3 surviving daughters. In Labor Day, we will be having a memorial for Hector at his farm in Tennessee, and we will be giving this award to his 3 daughters on that day.
It's my great honor to be the person who is acknowledging and stating the fact that Peggy Akers has won the VFP National Stewardship Award for this year. A person who really deserves it and has earned it 100%. I've known Peggy for probably 25, 30 years. She was a nurse in Vietnam, joined Veterans for Peace when she lived out in San Francisco, and joined forces with the likes of Paul Cox and Jim Janko, et cetera, working in schools, talking to young people about the reality of war and military service. I have had the honor of speaking with her on a number of occasions in high schools as we've done our work here in Maine. She moved to Maine and lives on Peaks Island and then also in Portland. She and I would join forces and go talk to high school students about the realities of war again. I would just watch these students. You know, we're talking an auditorium full of 150, 200 students, just absolutely enraptured with Peggy's words. I mean, Peggy has such an ability to speak so movingly about her experience without any kind of flourish or anything. She speaks directly. She's written a wonderful poem called Dear America about her experience as a nurse in Vietnam. So I've seen her in action that way. She is also the head nurse in a project called Seeds for Peace, which bring Israeli and Palestinian teenagers together for a 2-week camp experience here in Maine. She has been the person who's the nurse of that. And I know Peggy, and she does much, much more than take care of these people medically. She talks to them very clearly about what's going on. She doesn't proselytize. She doesn't try to make any case at all, but she just listens and then speaks from the heart, and with an immense level of experience and intelligence. She's just a remarkable human being. So she's done that work. In addition to doing that, of course, Peggy, who was in her mid-70s, as I am, still hasn't retired. She is a nurse down in Portland and on the islands. She works with unhoused teenagers and unhoused veterans. And she's been called upon to jump into a Piper Cub and fly out to an island off the coast to give vaccines to people who are asking for them. She also served for a time as the president of our chapter here in Maine and did an excellent job doing that. And she continues to be this force amongst us that is really unstoppable and a delight to be with. So it is truly, truly, truly a great honor to bestow upon her this award, which she very, very much deserves. So thank you, Veterans for Peace. Great stuff. She's a wonderful person. She deserves this 100%. So thank you again for the VFP for bringing this forward and recognizing Peggy.
Okay, I'm Dave Logston, Vice President of a local chapter here in the Twin Cities, Chapter 27. We've been a chapter for 35 years, and Uh, a couple of people have been stanchions in our group for a long time. And one of the people that I'm presenting for the Leadership in Peace Award exemplifies the and displays initiative, inclusiveness, tirelessness, and persistence, and moving the mission of Vets for Peace forward, either locally and nationally or internationally. Barry Reich, who I'm nominating for this award, I think is totally worthy of this award. And I'll tell you why. For over 30 years, he's been clean and sober. He's been a member of our chapter and has been the national president for a year. He's been our local president. Barry always does the Presente thing, does a wonderful job at that because he's a very profound individual and he does it in a very serious way. He always shows up. One of the things I've always said whenever I get a chance to address a local rally is to thank people for showing up. Because showing up is an important part of Vets for Peace. And anybody who's trying to organize in Vets for Peace will tell you showing up is very important. And Barry is a guy that shows up. And he shows up at the SOA Watch for many, many years and as a staple. And former President David Klein, who died from Agent Orange complications, Barry flew to his funeral, and not just being a presence there, he carried on David Klein's tradition at the SOA Watch with the Veterans March of doing a cadence with our own lyrics in the cadence that most people experience at boot camp. And Barry took up that mantle and was the guy who did the cadence thing at the SOA Watch. Locally, Barry is our membership, now is our current membership guy. And when I was president for 5 years, he would always say, Dave, I want to put membership. That should be the number one thing on the agenda, every meeting, number one thing on the agenda. And I said, okay, Barry, number one thing on the agenda, because he always says, we have to get members, we have to get younger, all this stuff. And Barry, whenever we get a new member, Barry would call them up and meet with them and have coffee with them and kind of vet them out and see where their skill, where their interests were. And he tries to do that with as many new members as he can. And he says he does that because if they just come to a meeting, they see a bunch of old white guys, they're going to walk out the door in about 2 seconds. So he said, I want to have coffee with him first. And then I said, well, now they get to talk to one old white guy, grumpy old white guy, before they get to the meeting. When we had the canoe raffle, which kept our chapter financially above water for years, Barry had the canoe in his garage, and he would be hauling that thing over to events, and he would be out there all day selling those raffle tickets. He was really good. I would be talking about Vets for Peace with people, but Barry was selling raffle tickets, and it was important work. And Barry was at Standing Rock 5 times. That's a long drive up there. It was winter, blizzards, and Barry was up there 5 different times at Standing Rock. Barry was at Jeju Island for the demonstrations in Korea on that island. And he came back, he ended up in the ER because he almost died. It's a long trip and he's not getting any younger. He's a member of the Unitarian Church in St. Paul. And as a member of that church, he's lobbied to have the plate passed once a year for Vets for Peace. And he usually raises about $750 every year for Vets for Peace through his congregation. He did that on his own. That's initiative. That's saying, I'm going to do this. Another thing, Barry, his initiation has been merchandise. A really nice Vets for Peace fleece things and jackets that people really are really dress us up till we look actually kind of professional when we talk to people. Barry is the one that did the legwork on it, and he still does the legwork. Somebody goes to our website and orders something. Barry goes and packages it all up, goes to FedEx and ships it off to people. And I mean, that's just saying, and that's just yesterday at the state capitol. We had Bruce Barry made a really nice stop at line 3 banner, and Barry was on the other end of that thing. And Bruce was on one end, Barry was in the middle, and I was on the other end. So he continues to show up for events, and he has for all these years. If you have an action and an event, Barry is there. Peace out to Barry.
Good evening to all the peace warriors out there. My name is Jonathan W. Hutto Sr., longtime supporter of Veterans for Peace, member of Veterans for Peace, and I've been assigned the task and have the honor, I'm both honored and humbled this evening, to present the Howard Zinn Lifetime Achievement Award to Dr. David Courtwright, affectionately known to me as David. I first met David as an active duty member of the United States Navy when the 30th anniversary copy of Soldiers in Revolt was sent to me when I was an enlisted sailor off the coast of Iraq. And you would see that the foreword to this 30th anniversary copy was written by Howard Zinn. This book was first published in 1975 when David Courtwright was a PhD student under the guidance of Mark Raskin at the Institute for Policy Studies. David Courtwright, I can't say enough about Dave. I don't have enough time to really say all that I want to say about David, but I'll tell you this. David, if there is a living embodiment to what Howard Zinn exemplified in his life, one who came to know the horrors of war, Howard himself as a bombardier in World War II, one who then became a scholar himself, an academician beginning at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, who through the weight of his scholarship and advocacy within the civil rights struggle with his students from Spelman College, people like Alice Walker, those like Mary Wright Elderman and many others. Howard, who then went on to become very critical and an advocate for peace within that Vietnam conflict, and then his masterpiece, many of us have it on our shelves today, A People's History of the United States. David Courtwright himself followed a similar trajectory coming out of University of Notre Dame, volunteering for Vietnam so he could be in the band and not have to potentially have his life snatched from him on the battlefield of Vietnam, becoming engaged in the GI movement, becoming a fighter for peace from within the military, and then chronicling that struggle within this book, which 30 years later had a significant impact upon me on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt. David Courtwright labors, and has labored, in that tradition of what Dr. King calls the drum major instinct. With David, from what I saw from David and how he nurtured us and helped us and guided us in the appeal for redress, which we launched in the fall of 2006, active duty military members at that time seeking to end the conflicts in Iraq, the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan through peaceful means. David labors in such a way where he doesn't seek greatness. He seeks to serve, and in so doing, he bumps into a little greatness along the way. So tonight, he's bumped into some greatness. He's bumped into this Howard Zinn Lifetime Achievement Award. I would be remiss not to say that David is an intergenerational struggler, just as he labored at the Institute for Policy Studies to publish this manual, which is still a guide for us today. It was a little over 30 years later that we received this award, the Atelier Moffitt Human Rights Award from that same institute, which gave David the resources and what he needed to be able to publish his masterpiece. So David, I'm very proud and very humbled and honored to present the Howard Zinn Lifetime Achievement Award to you, knowing that you're going to continue to labor for peace and continue to be an inspiration to my generation, to the generation coming after Generation X and to generations unborn. Salute, David. Peaceful salute to you. Thank you, and keep pressing on.
Wow. Yeah. So the awards is always it's always tough. There's so many people in the organization and connected to the organization doing the work that deserve to be recognized. You know, it's always amazing the folks who find themselves nominated, and it just felt right. But I know there's a lot of folks out there that deserve to get recognized, and I think we share in the celebration of all that work. And we have to take a moment every once in a while to celebrate the work that we do. So respect to Hector Black's family. Thank you for being here and being witness. And it's yeah, awards. The next thing I want to do, you know, we've been putting out a lot of content with Gamers for Peace. You know, I think there was a time of putting out more than 20 hours per week of original content out on the stream waves. And you know, it's crazy that you know, in a way, Veterans for Peace has its own television channel through Twitch programming. We have a really amazing selection of creative programs with a lot of young veterans and allies in there, producing stuff all the time and having conversations, interacting with audiences. And I want to play this video. It's kind of a montage that Jules was able to put together. And it's one of our programs. It's called the Ad Slam. And it's designed originally to really focus on military recruitment ads and just make fun of them in a Mystery Science 2000 sort of way. And there's a lot of intersections. We thought we could use this tool to look at a lot of different militarism and nationalist ideas, corporate ideas that we wanted to address. So here's a video. I hope it cheers you up as much as it does me.
Time to start this Friday off with our regularly scheduled military ad slam.
He's definitely coming off as crotchety old man. I'm definitely
yeah. He's already starting off to where he's just like, get off my lawn, you know, like.
Yeah, sorry, I don't need basic training. I did it in America's Army 3.
Okay, I want to get to the war criminal stuff.
If I play this game and get a high enough stats, do I still have to take the ads back?
Intelligence isn't perfect.
I'm furious.
I also love that it's not a hard sell while he goes through the menu options of how to link to Army careers.
Yeah, I mean, we got a lot wrong.
Yeah, I did 2 tours in America's Army 3.
Oops, we overthrew a government and killed 500,000 people.
This was designed by the Army as a recruiting tool, but it's a fun game.
I did that dumb decision of like, yeah, let's sign up at 17, and then I was like,
Jarvie, unrelated, are you okay?
So I think that proves it. If you hate militarism and like fun, come join us on Twitch and support Gamers for Peace and what we're doing with that initiative, because it is a lot of fun. Next, I want to bring Doug Rollins up. Doug, if you want to pop your camera and mic on. You know, as a founding member of the organization and put so many years of hard work and still does into our mission, Doug Rollins was gracious enough, fellow Mainer now, live right up the road. We'll have to have a beer sometime, Doug. Doug was gracious enough to step in and help see if we could find some support for the work that we do. So Doug Rollins, go ahead and take it away, sir.
Thanks, Gary. This has just been wonderful. You know, a couple of things. First of all, I have to correct Adrian. Adrian, it's not Rochester, it's Rochester. How do I know this? I was born in Rochester, December 8th, 1946. So as a founding member of Veterans for Peace, we could almost say that, it began in Rochester, New York. So I'm really proud to have that chapter recognized. Hurrah, hurrah. The other thing is, if this were a live convention, I wouldn't have to do much fundraising because we'd have a crew of people out in the parking lot stripping down your cars and selling whatever we can from those in order to bolster our budget. But since we don't have that, my task is to convince you to give money to this wonderful organization that has been around since 1985 and is changing and growing with the times. And I'm really pleased to see all of this wonderful work that's being done with young people, especially as what Garrett was just referring to. So how can you contribute to making this a good place? Well, there's a whole list of various things. If you go to the website, the VFP website, national website, and go to the donate link, you'll see, you can renew your membership, $40, $75, $100. You can, if you're a student or can't afford the regular dues, you can work in a different payment plan, which is, I think, really cool. You could, of course, become a lifetime member, which is $1,000, or a one-time payment of $1,000 or $85 a month for a year. You can use that payment to honor others who are members of Veterans for Peace or are not, and people have done that in the past, set up honorary memberships for lots of different people. And contribute the money for that. Of course, if you're, this might not apply to too many people. If you're in your mid-70s or closing in on 80 or in your 80s or whatnot, you might be considering a bequest to actually put Veterans for Peace in your will, which I think would be a wonderful way of recognizing what's being done and continue your contribution to the organization after you're gone. We can do that. And I guess I just read where I didn't realize this, that you could actually donate a truck or a car or a boat even. And there's a group of people that'll pick it up and get money from it and then contribute that to Veterans for Peace. After listening to the keynote presentation today, I was just blown away by all the wonderful comments and all the wonderful thoughts and all the stuff that Veterans for Peace can do, has done in the past, is doing in the present, and will do in the future. So please, make an investment in this organization as much as you possibly can. I know most of you are investing in time. This is just wonderful. But if we can put a little bit more money in those coffers, that'd be really, really great. So thanks for this opportunity to address you and continue on.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for cheering us on and supporting us for this this long stretch, and we won't let you down. We'll carry on this legacy, and all the programs and all the efforts that you built and the foundations that you built. We're all going to carry that forward, and with everybody's support, we really appreciate that. So now is probably the most somber part of our program. We're going to move into the Presente. We've lost a lot of members this year. It's been a hard year, and many of our members are not getting younger. So there's a lot of folks that have been submitted through the forums that have been going around for months, and there's a lot of folks that we don't know about. Many of them we don't have strong connections with our international chapters. So we're going to start it off. Danny's going to introduce a song by one of our fallen members, and then Barry's going to come on and read the Presente list. Danny, what do you have to say?
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. As we're moving into Presente, I'd just like to share a video of Jim Radford from VFP UK. It's one of his songs. It's The Shores of Normandy. Now, Jim was the youngest D-Day veteran and a lifelong activist for peace and social justice. But I'd like to dedicate this to all of our members who have passed, sadly, this last year, Presente.
In the cold grey light of the 6th of June, in the year of 44. The Empire lads sailed out from Poole to join with thousands more. The largest fleet the world had seen. We sailed in close array, and we set our course for Normandy at the dawning of the day. There was not one man in all our crew but knew what lay in store. For we had waited for that day through 5 long years of war. We knew that many would not return, but all our hearts were true. For we were bound for Normandy, where we had a job to do. Now the Empire Larch was a deep-sea tug with a crew of 33. And I was just the galley boy on my first trip to sea. I little thought when I left home of the dreadful sights I'd see. But I came to manhood on the day that I first saw Normandy. At Armagh, off the beach of gold, 'neath the rocket's deadly glare, we towed our block ships into place, and we built a harbour there. Mid shot and shell, we built it well, as history does agree. While brave men died in the swirling tide on the shores of Normandy. For every hero's name that's known, 1,000 died as well. On stakes and wires their bodies hung, rocked in the ocean swell. And many a mother wept that day for the sons they loved so well. Men who cracked a joke and catch the smoke as they stormed the gates of hell. As the years pass by, I can still recall the men I saw that day, who died upon that blood-soaked sand where now sweet children play. And those of you who were on board, who've lived in liberty, remember those who made it so on the shores of Normandy.
Well, Barry, will you come on stage, please? We'll miss Jim, certainly miss the many many comrades we've lost. Thank you, Barry.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Danny, for doing that. What a great guy. I'm glad that I got to know Jim. Certainly a great loss. And I thanks Garrett and all of you who at the office who keep track of these people that we lose each year. It's such an important thing. I'm so grateful that we do this. Take time to remember
our members that have fallen. You know, we don't get a lot of recognition. I got some this year. We don't get a lot of recognition for our work, you know. And I think it's great that we spend a little bit of time. You know, every name has got a story behind it. We can't spend a lot of time. It'd be nice if we could spend a lot of time talking about each person, but at least we acknowledge them and remember their lives. And so I'm gonna go down the list, and I'm gonna say the name and Presente, and you all can do that in your own homes, wherever you are. And at the conclusion, I'm gonna toll the bells at chapter 27. We ring bells on November 11th, remembering the war that end all wars, and we also do it in honor of people's service to end wars. So we do it at graveside services and whatever people request it, we do. So I'm going to toll the bell at the conclusion. Okay. Stanley Loftschi, chapter 1, Auburn, Maine, Tom Sturtevant chapter, Presente. Gilbert W. Hales, chapter 10, Albany, New York, Presente. Gretchen Nielsen, chapter 13, Tucson, Arizona, Presente. Paula Kaplan, chapter 19, Riverside, San Bernardino City, California, Presente. Frank Wagner, chapter 21, Northern New Jersey, Presente. Stephen Palomino, chapter 21, Northern New Jersey, Presente. Robert Kimbrough, chapter 25, Southern Wisconsin, Clarence Kalin chapter, Presente. Robert K. Johnson, chapter 27, Minnesota, Presente. Gerald Schneck, chapter 27, Minnesota, Presente. Ralph Hilgendorf, chapter 27, Minnesota, Presente. Cher Fields, one of our founding members, chapter 27, Minnesota, Presente. Paul Smart, chapter 32, Miami, Florida, Presente. Bill Davis, chapter 34, New York, New York, Presente. William Bill Dahlman, 46, Monterey, California, Presente. Jerry Epler, chapter 46, Monterey, California, Presente. George M. Wilson, chapter 46, Monterey, California, Presente. Terry Becklick, chapter 50, Northern Michigan, Presente. James Kulzik, 50, Northern Michigan, Presente. Ralph Van Waldhuizen, chapter 50, Northern Michigan, Presente. Robert Burnett, chapter 50, Northern Michigan, Presente. John Lewis, Northern Michigan, chapter 50, Northern Michigan, Presente. Clarence Prince Jr., 66, Austin, Texas, Neil Bishkoff chapter, Presente. Jared Takelberg, 69, San Francisco, California, Presente. Hector Black, chapter 89, Nashville, Tennessee, Presente. Bernard Fine, 95, Springfield, Mass, Wally Nelson chapter, Presente. Dr. James Lattimore, chapter 99, Asheville, North Carolina, Presente. Donald F. McKeating Jr., chapter 25, Southern Wisconsin, Clarence Kalin chapter, Presente. Phil Smith, chapter 100, Southeast Arkansas, Presente. Brigham Marnold, chapter 101, South Bay Peninsula, California, Presente. Joseph R. Herbert, 102, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Presente. Terry Kahn, 102, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Presente. Kevin Zeiss, 105, Baltimore, Maryland, Phil Barrican Memorial Chapter, Presente. Eugene Cady, 109, Olympia, Washington, Rachel Corey Chapter, Presente. Leonard Helgott, 111, Bellingham, Washington, Presente. Charles E. Butler, 129, Pueblo, Colorado, Presente. Edward Epley, Chapter 132, Corvallis, Albany, Oregon, Presente. Gettysburg, Chapter 160, Hoa Binh, Vietnam, Chapter, Presente. Paul Spray, 166, Knoxville, Tennessee, Presente. Carlos Chuck Muna, Chapter 178, Northern Colorado Peace Fellowship, Presente. Ted Pratt, Chapter 178, Northern Colorado Peace Chapter, Presente. Barry Miller, Independent, Presente. Dan Ian Collins, Independent, Presente. Victor Ivan Sherb, Independent, Presente. Walt Nichols, Independent, Presente. Linda Smith, Independent, Presente. Steve W. Osborne, Independent, Presente. Randall Russell, VFP UK, Presente. And of course, Jim Radford, UK, Presente. That concludes the names I'm going to now told about. Thank you for your work, you all. Presente.
Thank you, Barry, for always picking up the hard work. And you deserve that award, man. Thank you for being here for us.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave, for doing that for me. I was unexpected.
Awesome. Thanks, Barry.
Okay, thanks. I'll mute now.
Well, that's pretty much coming to an end of our program. It's hard to see that list grow every year. We need more mutual aid, more holding our communities tight. So reach out if you need help with anything, and we'll try to figure out where the resources are to pick up our communities. Yeah, if you hear of any other names or if we missed anyone, feel free
I've
to.
posted the additional names in the chat.
Oh, okay. Rose Shaw, Chapter 63, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Phil Smith, Chapter number 100, Southeast Alaska, Kevin Zeese. Jim Wallace, Chapter 9, and Peter Woodruff, Chapter 1, Presente. Well, we still have more program to go. We end on a somber note here, but we pick it back up with the music in celebration, and hopefully we can come together as a family, as a nation, and as an organization there. Hard discussions tomorrow. Adrian, do you want to explain what we're doing tomorrow morning?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you again. Just to echo Garrett's thoughts, please feel free to join the social room tonight. Check out the music. Tomorrow morning, we're going to be starting with the VFP moving forward to include a discussion of our code of conduct, transformative justice, Be the Change Book Club, and other ways that members are exploring our own privileges and prejudices and how we can work to understand them and perhaps find ways to overcome them. So, that's a lifelong learning lesson. And I guess that's part of learning to overcome them, is that they'll never be completely overcome, but we have to be open to the learning that comes with life. And actually that kind of reminds me of Viet's talk too, that people's stories are not the simple narratives we know, but everything is more complex, and learning to, see how everybody experiences life and the own prejudices we have. It's just an important part of it. And so that'll be space that we have in the morning, to be followed by our plenary at 11 a.m. Central Time. That's 9/11 and 20 years of veteran anti-militarism action and activism. Our closing event, and then another event in the evening. Who are the criminals? How can we demilitarize drones and abolish war? So followed by another film and panel discussion. So, there's still many opportunities for us to engage, and I look forward to seeing you all and spending time in discussion.
Well, hopefully you could join us for later tonight. If not, we'll see you tomorrow morning. But I'm gonna get the dancing vet out on the dance floor and see everybody at the music event tonight. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and keep out there working hard and making peace happen. Cheers, everyone.